Resolved that cultural or political restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are unjustified.
Isn't it possible that agricultural and infrastructure factors are not necessarily tied to culture or politics?
No, I don't think that's true at all.
So you can't have bad irrigation and
I don't think that's true at all.
Watch New Jersey's mental athletes vie for the trophy and the title on the JPMorgan Chase Lincoln Douglas debates.
Coming up next on NJN.
This program is made possible by a grant from JPMorgan Chase.
Resolved that cultural or political restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are unjustified. That's the topic of this year's exciting JPMorgan Chase Lincoln Douglas debates. Join us as our teams take sides either for or against the resolution. I'm Desiree Taylor, and in the next hour, 4 New Jersey high school teams will present their case. At stake, the trophy, title, and reputation as the best and brightest debaters in New Jersey. In the inexperienced tier, Westfield meets Bayonne, and in the experienced tier, Randolph squares off against Milburn. Dividing the competition into inexperienced and experienced tiers levels the playing field and encourages more schools to participate. Now here's Janet Rodriguez, Senior Philanthropy Manager at JPMorgan Chase.
Hello, and welcome to the final round in the 2006 Lincoln Douglas Debate Competition. This is our 15th year sponsoring a values debate program for public high school students in New Jersey. Throughout the years, the students have debated propositions about the election process, open-door immigration, hate speech on campuses, and many other questions that don't have easy answers. This year's topic is no different, as our debaters consider the value of placing restrictions on the right of access to humanitarian aid. All of us at JPMorgan Chase are proud of their accomplishments and proud to provide this program for students. Whatever the outcome, every participant is truly a winner. Good luck and thank you.
The road to the finals began last March with the announcement of this year's topic. Teams then had 2 months to prepare for the competition, which took place at Rutgers University on May 23rd. 42 schools sent teams to match wits in 4 preliminary rounds. After the quarterfinal round, just 8 teams, 4 in each tier, continued on to the semifinals. In addition to Westfield and Bayonne, North Brunswick and Robbinsville were semifinalists in the inexperienced tier. And along with Randolph and Milburn, Hopewell Valley and Pascack Valley were semifinalists in the experienced tier. The outcome of the semifinals determined the teams you're about to see debate. No one went home empty-handed, though. JPMorgan Chase also provides a financial incentive. All debaters received a check for $50 just for participating. Schools did well, too, with checks for $100 each. And as teams climbed the ladder of success, the amounts increased. Finalists each took home $250, as did their schools. And so 42 schools have been whittled down to the final 4 teams you're about to see. Quite an achievement. I know everyone is anxious to get started, but before we launch our debate, let's give the uninitiated some background on the format.
The rules. 3 members on each team.
And 1 alternate.
Each team must be prepared to debate both sides of the issue. Yes,
No.
yes,
No.
yes,
Yes.
that's what I said. But they will not be notified which side they'll present until the time of the debate.
Oh, we have just 4 minutes to prepare.
No insults.
Go ahead.
There are strict time constraints. The terminology. First, affirmative constructive. What is that?
The first affirmative constructive is when a person on the affirmative team sets out arguments to uphold the resolution.
Then the opposing team gets to cross-examine the speaker.
They are going to have to ask very tough questions of their opponents.
First, negative constructive.
To lay the groundwork for the negative case,
and then to find the chink or the flaw in the affirmative resolution and case.
Then the affirmative side gets to cross-examine the negative side. Ha ha! Second affirmative debater gets to then continue the case.
To take the information from the cross-examination and use it in the second affirmative speech to try and rebuild the affirmative case, which has been knocked down by the negative, and try to expand the affirmative case in order to go and make the affirmative the winning case.
Second negative constructive.
The negative now has to rebuild his position and explain why the negative is still valid. The second job is to re-attack the affirmative.
Last but by no means least, the rebuttal.
They're responsible for taking all the issues in the round and narrowing them down in those final 2 minutes to ensure their team a victory.
And remember, the judges' decisions are final.
If some of that went by you too fast, we just want to emphasize this is a values debate. A values debate focuses on what we as human beings value. This is in contrast to the more usual policy debate, which looks at practical applications or a plan of action to support a position. Bill Barthelemy, debate's technical advisor, explains it this way.
Values debate is concerned with the basic values important in American society, such as liberty, equality, freedom, and how those values are exemplified in the topic that we have to debate.
Now let's meet our honorable judges. They'll be ruling on how well our debaters meet those criteria. Jonathan Alston is a teacher and debate coach at Newark Science High. Dario Camara joins us from Ridge High School in Basking Ridge to judge the inexperienced tier. Mimi Rosenbaum will step in to judge the experienced tier. She teaches at University High School in Newark, where she also coaches the debate team. Sarah Ryan is a debate mentor for the Bronx Defenders Debate Initiative. Mark Douglas also crossed the Hudson to be here. He's with the New York Impact Coalition and also serves as program coordinator for the New York JPMorgan Chase debates. This is the 4th year Abdul Barate has served as a judge on these debates. He will be assistant debate coach at University High School in Newark in the fall. And finally, meet our debate technical advisor and timekeeper, Bill Barthelemy, former chairman of the New Jersey District of the National Forensic League. This is Bill's 13th year of service on this program. He'll be making sure that our teams follow all the rules and stick to the designated times. Now for our inexperienced tier debate. This year, Westfield meets Bayonne. Because these teams debated at Rutgers in May, they must now take opposing sides on the issue. So Westfield will take the affirmative side, and Bayonne will counter with the negative. Let's meet the teams. From Westfield, first affirmative constructive, Julie Tiedrich. From Bayonne, first negative constructive, Miriam Nematala. Remember, it is the first constructives who set out the case, and they are the only ones allowed to read their statements. Back to the affirmative side, representing Westfield, Pat McCabe holds the second affirmative constructive position, while his counterpart, Augustin Paniagua, takes the second negative constructive for Bayonne High School. It is the responsibility of the negative team to start the fight. The negative must initiate the clash in the debate round. Finally, our two cross-examiner rebuttalists, Ben Zacharin for Westfield and Eric Delgado for Bayonne. Once again, our topic for debate, resolved that cultural or political restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are unjustified. Westfield, are you ready to begin? Bayonne, are you ready to begin? Then, starting with the first affirmative constructive, Julie Tiedrich. Let's debate.
Our value premise for the round will be global welfare, defined by Merriam-Webster as financial or other aid provided, especially by the government, to people in need. When people are devastated by disasters or other crises, those who have the ability to help the needy have a moral responsibility to do so. An example of a failure to help those in need is the reaction to the Clinton administration to the genocide of the 1 million Tutsis in Rwanda. Nations must be able to ignore their petty differences in order to promote better conditions for humanity, a true showing of benevolence and morality. In order to establish and maintain global welfare, we must all show benevolence and morality in our response to those in need. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Is there a possibility that if we give aid to certain countries, this aid can get into the wrong hands and hinder the people instead of helping them?
No.
Okay, so there is no possibility. But are you aware that of 2 million tons of food that were sent to North Korea in the past 2 years, most of it has gone to feed tyrant armies?
Well, how is it being given to those people? How is the humanitarian aid being provided to those people?
It's given.
There's a possibility of different different ways that humanitarian aid can be provided, and it also does not have to be through food. It can be through monetary, clothing.
Okay, yes, but if in that case it can be more harmful than helpful, correct?
Humanitarian aid may help sustain people for the present time, but what happens to them in the future? Instead of constantly giving these countries humanitarian aid, we should fight their immoral, corrupt, and debased governments. An ancient Chinese proverb says, "Give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach him how to fish and he eats for a lifetime." Our value in today's debate will be utilitarianism, defined as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. There is no way to ensure the money and aid given to radical governments will reach the proper destination. In that regard, the aid intended for beneficial purposes will do more harm than good. Sanctions ultimately become the means of justice.
You said that you would prefer changing a government in a country as opposed to giving aid to a people. That's what you said.
Correct.
So you're advocating overthrow of a government which would possibly and has often created a greater humanitarian crisis in some countries. Is that correct? Yes or no?
No, I don't think so.
But you just said you were advocating overthrowing governments. That creates humanitarian crises.
No, I don't think it creates a humanitarian crisis because, well, what we're doing is there's temporary hardships for the present that will serve as motivation for future change and reform.
Thank you. Why should a people be punished with sanctions on humanitarian aid if they can't control
because
the government's policies?
You don't know where the humanitarian aid is going.
Our opponents stated a value premise of utilitarianism and a value criterion of progression. However, they offered no specific connection between their contentions and these values. They spoke often of corruption and how it is very risky to give aid because of the possibility that the aid could fall into the hands of dictators or other groups. However, that is a completely wrong attitude to take in humanitarian situations because we must value the life of a person more than just the risk of this aid falling into wrong hands. A solution to these problems can be the UN, in which UN peacekeeping troops can deliver aid and give it to the people effectively.
So you're saying that it's okay if we help some people at the expense of others?
It's not at the expense of others.
The risk is that if we give aid to certain groups, that there's a possibility that certain groups will be hindered. So you're trying to help one person at the expense of another, correct?
No, I'm advocating giving aid to people in need.
Giving aid to people in need, but would you agree with me that aid can have a harmful effect?
No.
So are you aware that in cases where humanitarian aid workers move to certain areas, there's so much inflation that because these workers are willing to pay high prices for staples and for rents, that once these workers leave, there's mass inflation in the economy. Are you aware of that?
That is not the focus of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid
but it's a consequence. It's a consequence of humanitarian aid.
We firmly believe that the primary purpose of humanitarian aid is to provide individuals with economical, social, and political tranquility in the most efficient and controlled manner. It is not logical to gamble billions of dollars in countries which cannot provide the assurance that aid is reaching the intended group of people. If we fail to place sanctions on such countries and continue to blindly assist corrupt governments, we only entice support for the mistreatment of people. Instead of encouraging an end to the atrocious violations of humanity, we encourage despotism. We can help people by sanctions and by supporting our values of utilitarianism and our value criteria of progress.
Suppose a country like Cuba is hit by a terrible hurricane. Should we not give them aid because we don't agree with the government's principles?
If we believe that we can provide efficient aid, that the country, that the people will receive the money, then certainly we can provide aid. But if we're not sure that the aid is reaching the people and reaching the hands of Fidel Castro and this corrupt government, how can we blindly provide aid?
Restrictions are necessary, and allowing aid to flow freely to countries with political and cultural problems is simply irrational. The few benefits of providing aid do not outweigh the downfalls. As Kenyan economist James Shikwati once said, "Good intentions can't justify harmful aid." Providing the means to achieve political progress through restrictions such as sanctions is arguably the most humanitarian act possible. We need the involvement of the government and their people to maintain and build peace. The negative achieves progress and helps the people in the long term through utilitarianism, and that is the truly most humanitarian action we can provide.
Our value premise was global welfare. Our value criterion were benevolence and morality. Our first contention was that people in need deserve aid. Our second contention was humanitarian differences should transcend political or cultural differences. Immediate relief is often needed, and our opponent advocates not giving this relief just because it could go to an oppressive government. Fact of the matter is, aid can be given to people through UN troops, and aid can become in the form of food, medicine, and clothing, not just money. Sanctions of value proposed by our opponent often push people who cannot control the governments into poverty, such as the people of Cuba. Our opponent contends we should not risk giving money in case it doesn't reach the proper destination. But I asked the judges, is life not worth a little risk? As I said, we must be able to take risks to save human lives. That's our premise. Thank you.
Time. That wraps up our first debate. Let's have a round of applause for both our teams. And while the judges make their final decisions and Bill adds up the scores, let's pay a visit to Westfield High School and to Bayonne.
Westfield, New Jersey is a vibrant suburban community located about 25 miles away from New York City. The high school is a dynamic center of learning and discovery for more than 1,700 students who take pride in the school's reputation for academic achievement. Students here can take advantage of more than 60 co-curricular activities, including 27 varsity athletic teams. Westfield High School is a place where students can explore their interests and fulfill their greatest potential. Our debate team is proud to represent our school in this competition, and we hope to contribute to the school's tradition of excellence.
Bayonne High School, founded in 1882, offers a diversified curriculum to its 2,489 students. It has been named a star school and received 7 Best Practices Awards. Bayonne can boast of its 13-acre campus located on the waterfront. Its Gothic architecture is magnificent. Our library is a mix of old world and high-tech, and our planetarium is one of the best in the state. We have an indoor ice rink and track facilities, outdoor tennis courts, and the use of the Don Ahern Stadium, which is located adjacent to our campus. Bayonne High School is a true melting pot of nationalities. We are representatives of 50 nations. Finally, the true measure of success is the fact that approximately 82% of graduates attend post-secondary schools and 6% plan to join the armed services. Bayonne High School's academic and athletic programs certainly prepare its students for a successful future.
To keep the suspense going, we're not going to reveal who the winner is until the end of the show, but we are going to tell you a little bit about the original Lincoln Douglas debates with the help of eminent Princeton historian James McPherson.
In 1858, the state of Illinois, population about 1.5 million, held a Senate race. The candidates were Abraham Lincoln and Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln carried the banner for the new Republican Party, just 2 years old.
In those days, the people, the voters, did not elect senators. The senators were elected by the state legislature.
Stephen Douglas, running for re-election, was a national figure. Abraham Lincoln was much less well known, and so, having nothing to lose, he challenged the senator to an unprecedented series of 7 debates.
These debates took place all over the state, the northern part of the state, which was kind of pro-Republican, and the southern part, which was pro-Democratic, and in the central part of the state, which was sort of evenly contested.
The debates were radically different from the contests we know today. They took place in the open air, without benefit of microphones, before thousands of people.
Farmers who drove in from the countryside, townspeople who turned out. They were at the mercy of the weather, but that didn't stop the people from staying and listening.
The debates lasted for 3 hours. The first speaker spoke for an hour. Then his opponent responded for an hour and a half. And finally, the first speaker had another half hour to close.
That the owners cared nothing about the property that was declared to be theirs, the property that the decision said was theirs.
Both of them spoke only from a few notes. It was almost entirely extemporaneous. And in fact, the audiences in these debates played a direct part in it. There would be shouted questions from the crowd. There would be boos, hisses, catcalls, cheers.
Lincoln, at 6'4", towered over his opponent, nicknamed the Little Giant, who measured just 5'4".
Lincoln had a kind of high-pitched tenor voice. Douglas was accounted the better orator. He could roll off a long, melodious sentence that could sway his followers.
He says they must become all free or all slave, otherwise this house cannot stand divided against itself.
The issue at all 7 debates was slavery.
Lincoln said over and over again that slavery was a social, moral, and political evil. Douglas, on the other hand, said that he cared not whether slavery was voted up or down. That his principle was that the people, local self-government of a territory or of a state, should have the right to decide on this for themselves.
In the end, although Lincoln won the popular vote, Douglas was reelected by the legislature. The debates, though, propelled Lincoln to national prominence, which set the stage for his presidential nomination just 2 years later.
When Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on an anti-slavery platform, the South took that as the handwriting on the wall, and so they seceded.
And so the Lincoln Douglas debates took their place in history. They were an essential link in a chain of events that led to the Civil War. 600,000 lost their lives during that war, but the House, our nation, undivided, still stands.
Lincoln and Douglas ran against each other again in the presidential election of 1860. It was a four-way race. Douglas got the second largest number of votes, but as we know, Lincoln became president, the South seceded, and the rest is history. And now the debate we've all been waiting for. From the experienced here by coin toss, Milburn High School will take the affirmative side, while Randolph will try to negate the resolution by defending the idea that restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are justified. Let's meet the team members. From Milburn, Steve Liu is first affirmative constructive. First negative constructive from Randolph, Rushab Doshi. Back to the affirmative side, our second constructive is Greg Hertz. The second affirmative constructive must rebuild and expand the case for the resolution. Our second negative constructive, Jeff Fox, must now further the negative's case for restricting access to humanitarian aid. Remember, it is the negative team's responsibility to also initiate a clash with the affirmative's position. And finally, our very important cross-examiner rebuttalist. They must not only cross-examine the opposing side's team members, but at the end of the debate, deliver a 3-minute rebuttal which supports their own side and refutes the opposition. Daniel Rauch from Milburn will argue the affirmative's case, and Matt Levinson from Randolph will sum up the negative's case. Our topic for debate once again, resolved that cultural or political restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are unjustified. Milburn, are you ready to begin? Randolph, are you ready?
Yes.
Let's debate. First affirmative constructive, Steve Liu.
A decent provision for the poor is a true test of civilization. When Samuel Johnson wrote these words, he was writing about society within England alone. In today's global village, however, national boundaries no longer define our community. Indeed, in an era characterized by global interdependency and the recognition of universal human rights, humanitarian crises worldwide can no longer be viewed as someone else's problem. As the victors of the Cold War, liberal Western democracies like the United States have often risen admirably to these challenges. Yet, many policymakers today want to take a step backwards from the recognition of universal humanity and only support those in countries who agree with their political and cultural values. Because we stand united in believing this to be a fundamental injustice, we affirm that cultural or political restrictions placed on the right of access to humanitarian aid are unjustified. Humanitarian aid is money or physical items that provide direct and needed alleviation of disparity. Cultural and political restrictions are barriers to the distribution of aid used in situations in which a culture or the political environment is incongruous with the ideals of the donor nation. In contrast to the narrow-minded pursuit of self-serving ideology, we stand to uphold the value of universal justice. We believe that all people, whether they're born into a democracy or dictatorship, has a right to necessary and vital humanitarian aid. Because the ultimate injustice is to be born into a hopeless cycle of poverty and to know that for arbitrary ideological differences you can never escape, the criterion is minimalization of human suffering. Our first contention is that we don't choose where we are born. Before we emerge into the world, we have no idea if we will be a citizen of Bolivia, Botswana, or Brooklyn. Great philosophers such as John Rawls have observed this seemingly random distribution and have concluded that there's no moral significance to the circumstances into which we are born. As a result, discriminating between individuals based on political and cultural differences will always be arbitrary and unjust. If we conform to such a system, we're denying millions of individuals a chance at life for reasons outside of their control. Our second contention is that the cultural or the political restrictions that are often imposed do not represent universal values, but instead ephemeral political ideologies. An example of this is a Millennium Challenge account, in which our administration decided to restrict foreign humanitarian aid to countries that did not practice abstinence-only education as part of their system. In so doing, we make human life a contingent tool for indoctrination. We're choosing to remain in an ivory tower of idealism even as millions die of disease and hunger. While this example is particularly egregious, it is indicative of the inherent imperfection in deciding what political or cultural norms ought to be respected. As a result, by making restrictions permissible, we will allow donors to prolong suffering for random subjective causes. Only by affirming can we make sure that we never prioritize partisan and transient ideologies over the immutable and unchanging worth of human life. Our third contention is that humanitarian aid can break the cycle of desolation that's often the root cause of the cultural and political factors that were originally concerned for its denial. As Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia University observed, the countries that suffer from the most appalling conditions of poverty and disease are those whose culture and polity are most different from the values of Western democracy. In addition, Bhagwati notes that until these countries reach a bare basic minimum of material prosperity, they will not begin to move toward our accepted ideals. As such, by removing all cultural and political restrictions, we can create the conditions in which the values we hold dear can flourish. Paradoxically, the countries and cultures that are most different from us are the ones that may well need our help the most. In closing, we see that while it is important to respect our cherished cultural and political beliefs, it's far more important to recognize broader obligations to all mankind. For this reason, we strongly urge an affirmation of this resolution, and I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Time. Thank you. Next, third negative cross-examiner, Matt Levinson.
So the first contention of your case is that everyone is equal because we don't choose where we're born, correct?
Yes.
So that would not only apply to humanitarian aid, but it also might apply to something like medicine, correct?
Mm-hmm.
However, even though everyone is equal, that doesn't mean that everyone should receive the same medicine. For instance, if the medicine produces side effects and is counterproductive to making you more healthy, we should restrict the use of that medicine, even if you're equal to everyone else, correct?
I don't see how that applies to resolution, but I guess
okay, well then,
in that analogy it works.
True. Okay, so then using that logic, if humanitarian aid in certain instances were counterproductive to the goals of getting people more food, more shelter, and more financial security, wouldn't that mean that we restrict that humanitarian aid?
I don't think that works because we're looking at the practical aspects of the resolution instead of cultural and political restrictions themselves. Okay. All you're saying is that we shouldn't give aid to people who don't use aid or in systems which don't use aid.
If humanitarian aid is counterproductive to giving people financial security or feeding them, doesn't that mean that humanitarian aid would therefore need to be restricted?
You have to draw a link into a resolution.
Okay, thank you. The second contention states that the cultural and political restrictions do not represent universal values, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that relevant?
Why is it not relevant?
Well, why does the negative have to advocate passing judgment on other people's values? Isn't it possible to say that a certain culture might prevent the infrastructure that's necessary for development?
As the negative side of the resolution, you have to defend all cultural and political restrictions. I don't think it's fair to only take the most legitimate restrictions or the most illegitimate restrictions. So that's why we're not advocating just one restriction.
Okay, so we would have to defend any possible restriction of humanitarian aid for any reason?
You have to defend the principal restrictions themselves.
We just have to advocate one reason why the aid would be restricted. Certain instances where we wouldn't give aid.
You in that sense alone, you were talking about one reason. And I don't think one reason is enough to fully negate the resolution.
Okay, and in the third contention, you say that we want to break the cycle of oppression. Mm-hmm. However, if there are other alternatives that are better, that are mutually exclusive from humanitarian aid, should we still give aid?
First negative constructive, Rushabh Doshi.
Humanitarian action must go deeper than simply meeting people's physical needs. It must address the issues that have caused them to remain marginalized and trapped in disadvantaged positions. Because I agree with Deborah Maresca that physical relief is often counterproductive in view of culture and politics, I negate. The value premise is institutional legitimacy because some social institution, either the government or the humanitarian organization itself, ultimately makes the decision to restrict aid. Legitimate institutions evaluate their own effectiveness and ultimately limit measures that are counterproductive to their mission. For instance, a doctor committed to good health will restrict the use of medication that induces substantially harmful side effects. Thus, the value criterion is restricting counterproductive action. Contention 1. Humanitarian aid should be restricted because it is often counterproductive to the goal of assisting the downtrodden. According to Jens Larsen and George Peeler, quote, Western wealth is supposed to speed African development and fight grinding poverty, but the result often doesn't match the intent. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe has single-handedly destroyed the economy with Western aid flowing. 80% of Zimbabweans live below the poverty line, and land reform, subsidized with British developmental support, takes lives and destroys agriculture. Mugabe takes the cash himself and blames the West, end quote. In other words, we must politically restrict any aid that flows through corrupt governments, such as Mugabe's Zimbabwe, because A, the money logically and empirically does not filter to those who need it, and B, we prolong an oppressive regime by allowing it to mishandle or outright steal finances. Prolonging corrupt politics is counterintuitive to the notion of long-term aid. Furthermore, Kenyan economist James Shikwati contends that Western drought assistance undermined Kenya's farmers and merely delayed reforms. It is clear that, on a cultural level, aid makes little sense if the real issue is severe agricultural and infrastructural ineffectiveness. Aid only prolongs such economic instability by placing a Band-Aid solution on a wound that really needs stitches. Development is the real solution. Larsen and Peeler conclude, quote, "It is not easy to deny aid to innocents, but the West must start offering the tough love, which is Africa's only true hope. Nations and multinational institutions that want to help should beg, cajole, and browbeat the African nations to remove trade barriers continent-wide, the fastest and least risky way to bring support directly to the small farmers, tradespeople, and entrepreneurs who are Africa's future." So now let's look at our opponent's case. Start with one of their definitions. An important key term in this round is going to be what a restriction on humanitarian aid is. Understand, we're not justifying restrictions on our cultural ideals. Instead, we're saying that these restrictions should be justified on the political or cultural situation in that area. So their definition seems to indicate that we're justifying it on ideals, whereas in reality, we're just justifying it on the empirical situation there. Then go to the value criterion of minimizing suffering. My teammate Matt made a comment earlier in cross-examination about how you would restrict medicine if that medicine actually caused more harm than benefit. So in cases where medicine, or in this case humanitarian aid, actually causes a harm, restricting it is justified because it would actually help the situation. So now let's look at their first contention. They talk about how we don't actually choose where we're born, so discrimination is arbitrary, and they give them the example of the Millennium Challenge, and of course, essentially how we should always give humanitarian aid regardless of cultural boundaries. But again, the response I just gave you earlier, in certain instances, restricting humanitarian aid actually makes sense because, first of all, the humanitarian aid might not even get to the people because a corrupt dictator might take the money for himself. Second of all, sometimes the humanitarian aid actually aids the corrupt dictator because, of course, if the money has to flow through the nation, it has to flow through that dictator as well. And third of all, if you want the money to go straight to the people, that's actually negating the resolution because you're placing a restriction on whether the government can actually get the money. So now let's go down to their second contention. There they tell you that restrictions are not representing true human values. But remember what I said to the definition earlier. We're not restricting based on our values. We're restricting based on the political or cultural situation that is present there. So their second contention doesn't really apply to the resolution. Finally, let's go to their third contention where they talk about how aid breaks the cycle of poverty. First of all, I'd say again that aid doesn't always break the cycle of poverty. And second of all, it often enchains people in developmental situations. Third of all, I'd also say that...
Next, third affirmative cross-examiner, Daniel Rauch.
Rushab, we have a right to freedom of speech, right?
Yes, in America we do.
Can this right be compromised?
In certain instances,
In
yes.
certain instances it can, but it's still a right.
Right, it's a right with exceptions.
It's a right with exceptions.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Moving on, in your case, you talk about how we shouldn't be giving money to places which have agricultural or infrastructural shortcomings, correct?
I'm saying that in certain instances we shouldn't because that would be counterproductive to the goal of actually helping the downtrodden.
Correct. However, agriculture and infrastructure are both physical factors, neither cultural or political, right?
Well, in this case, we're talking about specifically, the example we give you in our case has to do with cultural. And in fact, think about nomads, for example. Like if you were to give those nomads aid constantly, they would become dependent on that aid rather than developing the infrastructure they need.
My question for you is, isn't it possible that agricultural and infrastructure factors are not necessarily tied to culture or politics?
No, I don't think that's true at all.
So you can't have bad irrigation and good government.
I don't think that's true at all.
So irrigation and agriculture are directly tied to government and culture,
No,
right?
that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What we're saying specifically in our case is that it's dependent on culture because sometimes cultural scenarios or cultural realities actually preclude that nation from reforming or from changing.
Okay.
Take the nomads in...
Great.
Okay.
Moving along. I love the nomads, but we got to bounce. We're talking about politics and culture, and you say that we're not going to base this based on values. You say we're basing it on the empirical local situation, right?
I'm saying we're basing, yes, exactly, on the situation.
Okay. So who decides how to interpret the situation?
Well, what do you mean?
In other words, who is omnisciently saying that the empirics say the government is corrupt?
That's irrelevant to the debate. What we're talking about is whether or not such a restriction would be justified. So who decides is irrelevant. What I'm saying
well,
is
if the restriction is made unjustly, wouldn't you agree that it might not be
justified?
justified?
What I'm saying is that restriction on those grounds would be justified. That's what I'm saying.
But I'm saying who would define what grounds constitute it? Who decides what's a legitimate restriction?
Again, that's irrelevant. Let's bounce.
It's irrelevant, so anyone can decide. Let's bounce indeed. Okay. You talk about the government's right to receive aid, correct?
The government's right to receive aid.
The right to restrict aid to government.
I'm saying that restricting aid to a government would in fact be negating.
Time. Thank you. Next, second affirmative constructive, Greg Hertz.
Beginning on their criterion of the restriction of counterproductive action, we would argue first that the resolution talks about the right of access to humanitarian aid. We would argue that people will always have the right, or at least should always have the right to access of humanitarian aid. The problems that the negative advocacy points out are merely implementation problems. We would argue that those implementation problems could be avoided or at least somewhat mitigated if we use those aid through other factors such as non-governmental organizations. Second, we would say that we'll win all of the arguments anyway in terms of the negative impacts, so they're not going to become relevant in terms of taking out the offense on the affirmative case. So now going specifically to the negative contention. First, we would say that aid is necessarily benign because there's no specific causal link to problems within the government resulting from things that we're giving. In other words, we don't advocate giving nations bombs or anything that can be used directly for harms. We merely say that we should give them food or medical supplies. They never tell you specifically how that's going to result in a specific causal link to the prolongation of harmful regimes or anything like that. Second, we would say that the restrictions that they point out are not cultural or political restrictions, but rather restrictions just based on efficiency of that program. So, for example, when they talk about nomads, we would say that's not a political restriction. That's just a restriction based on what the type of group of people happens to be. Another example is the agricultural efficiency argument would just be a restriction based on economics, not a restriction based on polity or culture. Even if they give you a general principle about how most cultures or polities have a specific trend, they can't prove to you on any type of categorical level how all nations that have a specific polity will always be restricted. In other words, there are many nations that are deserving of this restriction that due to the ephemeral wishes of the negative advocacy, they would always be denied aid. Third, we would say that it's always comparatively better to give them at least some aid than no aid at all. The reason for that is that all these nations will always be stricken to poverty and disease and general distraught if we don't at least try to give them some aid. Even if there's some corruption, it's still going to trickle down to the people on some level. We say that's comparatively better. Now, throughout the round, Rushab keeps pointing out the two specific impacts of the negative case. The first, labeled as subpoint A, is that it doesn't filter to those who need the aid. Our answer is that even if it doesn't directly filter to people who need that aid, it's still comparatively better because they're probably going to get some of the aid. And even if they don't get the aid, there's no harm resulting from that aid. Then subpoint B is that it prolongs those needs. I guess that would be the specified harm that would result. But we say that first, those regimes are already corrupt. They're likely to have the money anyway. A little bit of food and medical supplies isn't really likely to prolong their regime. But second, that there's no specific causal link to the prolongation as a general principle just because we're giving people medical supplies. But now onto the affirmative case. The second and third contentions are largely glossed over. The second says that restrictions are really ephemeral political ideologies. This becomes tantamount in importance when you look at the round as a whole, because what it means is that the restrictions enacted when you negate the resolution aren't actually accomplishing what the negative case intends to do. Instead, they're ephemeral restrictions. His answer in the first speech is that they're not based on true universal values, or that they are based on the values of the donor nation. But if you look to their value analysis, they even say that nations evaluate their actions within the paradigm of their own legal framework. What that means is that nations are always self-referential. America considers democracy the best because we're a democracy. That's problematic in terms of giving foreign aid because the aid is only given in terms of ephemeral political ideologies instead of true human values. That takes out any type of impact in the negative case, and it means that it doesn't matter because the restrictions aren't going to be efficacious. Now, looking at the third contention, their response is just a cross-application of the negative case, but you can look at the Bhagwati analysis, which says that countries need a bare minimum of material prosperity before they can ever get rid of the harms of the world and the harms of prosperity. So in conclusion, we say that some aid is better than no aid, and that all nations need a basic material prosperity before they can overcome the problems of the modern world. Thank you.
Time. Thank you. Next, third negative cross-examiner, Matt Levinson.
Greg, the first response you make to our case is that there are different ways of implementing. Say, you can only give aid to NGOs, correct?
No. My first answer to the case is that the resolution questions the right of access to humanitarian aid.
Right. And you say there would be specific ways you want to implement it in order for it to be effective, right? Like you would give to NGOs and not directly to the government.
I'm not advocating a specific plan.
Right.
I'm merely saying that your negative case points out very specific implementational problems, whereas we're defending the theory.
If there are specific implementations that are always going to be a bad thing, doesn't that mean that you're restricting humanitarian aid? You're restricting the ways in which you give it.
But our argument is that they're not always going to be a bad thing because it's not, there are always other alternatives to that implementation.
But we're only restricting humanitarian aid, correct? So we can still give humanitarian aid, we can still give people money, but rather based on implementation, we can choose whether or not it's prudent or whether or not it's a logical thing to do.
We're arguing about the principle of aid, so I think it would be a little bit unfair for you to just claim, well, we're restricted in this specific case, but not in this case. Okay. We're saying that there are
Can we agree that the word restrict means that the negative is still giving people humanitarian aid, correct?
Well, as a general principle...
There are just instances where we don't, right? We pick and choose our spots a little more.
Okay, in Kenya, for example, in your case, you would never give aid to them because they're always going to classify under the criteria of the culture or polity
But can we agree that that's what it means to negate the resolution?
No, because any time you set up a criteria and that country meets that criteria, you categorically limit aid.
Excuse me?
Anytime that you set up a criteria for how you would limit aid, if the nation meets that criteria, then you always limit aid.
Let's look at the argument about not giving bad governments bombs, but rather food and medicine.
Right.
Since you don't necessarily indict the argument that that stuff won't filter down to the people, correct?
I think
like the food and medicine, right? If it's a tyrannical government, it has no incentive to protect its own people.
But
we're assuming
our argument is that at least
government.
some of the aid will go down to the people.
Why is that true? Why is that not a waste of resources, and why aren't there smarter ways to use those resources?
Well, I mean, I guess it goes back to the same argument that there are alternatives to government implementation of that aid.
Right, so we look to those alternatives. We restrict the way we give humanitarian aid, and we look to something like an NGO.
But our argument is that that's not a restriction.
Okay. Second negative constructive, Jeff Fox.
First, against our case, Greg says that that we're not talking about the resolution, that we're talking about the right to access, but instead that we're talking about implementation problems in the negative case. Greg is completely misunderstanding what we're saying. If you restrict something, i.e. we say that you can't have something in this instance, that's restricting the right to their access. They can't use their right to humanitarian aid. That's a restriction. So our negative case fully negates the resolution because we say that there are certain instances based on the politics or the culture of an area that we would restrict giving humanitarian aid because it would be counterproductive to the end goals. That's very clear. That very obviously negates the resolution and justifies a restriction. But secondly, when Greg says that we wouldn't give humanitarian aid in some circumstances, such as saying we don't give bombs to dictators or don't give money to dictators, that isn't in and of itself a restriction on aid. All negating means is that you can pick and choose the spots where you give aid rather than just blindly giving aid in every single circumstance possible. That's what it means to negate. Affirming means universal aid. That's a very clear distinction, and that's how I want you all to look at the round. Then, based upon how we're asking you to look at the round, we're saying that we restrict counterproductive action. Their criterion is minimizing suffering. If we show you how there are some instances where if you give humanitarian aid, it will only prolong the suffering of some people or actually increase the suffering of some people, that would justify restrictions in those circumstances. Remember, all restriction means is that we're not giving aid universally. So if we can show the political or cultural situations that might lead to that, that means you vote negative. That's very clear. So they make essentially two arguments against our case that all revolve around these two general themes. The first is that some aid is better than no aid, and that aid can always be benign. But first, aid can actually prolong oppressive situations. They never respond to the actual argument that Lawson and Peeler make. What they say is that aid, such as when the British gave developmental aid to Zimbabwe, can be abused by dictators to actually prolong their own power. For example, financial aid to Zimbabwe was stolen by Mugabe to further his own regime and oppresses people more and only prolong their suffering. Food aid can be stolen. Food aid might not necessarily filter down to the people. So rather than giving all types of aid blindly, we restrict the types of aid we give or restrict giving aid to that nation or that government because of the political situation. That's a first very clear reason why restrictions are justified, because it would only prolong the suffering of people. The second general theme that they talk about is based on this whole notion of efficiency, right? The word that they're saying that our developmental arguments are based upon some type of notion of economic efficiency, not cultural politics. They're completely disregarding what the argument says. What we're telling you is that there are certain cultures where given aid won't lead to any positive benefit. For example, an agrarian culture that's struggling, giving aid won't help them, but rather because they're agrarian culture, you might need to say lead to more industrialization. Or a nomadic culture, which is obviously a very cultural thing, giving them aid won't necessarily help them because they'll just take aid, but they won't have any basis for actually improving themselves in the long run. So aid will only prolong development, making them dependent upon aid. Remember, money isn't limited. Aid isn't unlimited. We need to pick and choose our spots so that we can help the most people overall. So we would rather encourage development in those situations and limit aid. That's very clear. Now, to touch on some facets of the affirmative case. The main argument that they're pulling across you is that restrictions are ephemeral, and that they're completely subjective. First, fine. There are certain times when you can restrict aid, it can be unjustified. But any situation is going to have its exceptions. Anybody can do something in a racist fashion. Just because something can be abused isn't a reason to reject it altogether. Because anything can be abused, so that's not really an argument. But then when they talk about their third contention, they never tell you a reason why when you negate the resolution, you increase the cycle of desolation. Rather, I'd say that you increase the cycle of desolation when you affirm the resolution because you give aid in situations where it can actually hurt people. And that's what leads to more suffering.
Thank you. Let's move to our third affirmative cross-examiner, Daniel Rauch.
Jeff, let's talk a little bit about domestic politics. We in America, once you don't commit any crimes, you got the right to vote, right?
Sure.
So I have the right to vote, and our soldiers overseas in Iraq have the right to vote as well, right?
Sure.
So I vote, and I logistically vote using a polling place, but these soldiers use absentee ballots. They use a different system, and their right to vote is served by a different mechanism. Now, is their right to vote equal to our right to vote?
I don't understand what you're asking. Are you mean equal functionally or equal like in types of like concept?
Equal in function and in value. Is their input in democracy not the same as ours?
Like, I would say that they have the same democratic right.
They have the same democratic right, even though it reached them in different ways.
Even though it reached in a different way, sure, but that's not really a major difference. Like, whether I check a ballot in Iraq or, okay, sure.
Thank you. So, as this is true, we both seem to agree that everyone has the right to basic necessities, health, medicine. It's just a question of getting them that right. We both agree in the value of human life, correct?
Sure. Everybody has a right to basic necessities.
Everyone does.
Sure.
Right. So
the necessities don't solely come from aid, right? They could, we give you clear examples in our case for when you give aid that actually prevents their ability to access their basic needs.
But we agree,
so that actually proves the negative.
We agree that it's important. As such, if we were to supply the right of access in a way that avoided governments, would we be restricting this right necessarily?
Yeah, that's a restriction. If you're saying we're applying aid that doesn't, in a way that it doesn't go to governments, that's restricting how we give aid because they're saying we don't give aid in the circumstances where we'll go to governments. That, by definition, is a political restriction.
But I just gave you an example of a right which was restricted in terms of mechanism, but which wasn't restricted in terms of value, right?
That's restricting. That is a political restriction because if you're saying it doesn't go to a government because of the nature of that government, a government is a political thing, so that's a political restriction. Then you just negated.
Super.
Thank you. That's time. Let's move to our third negative rebuttalist, Matt Levinson.
I'd like to thank the judges for judging what has certainly been a very heated debate, but ultimately it should be very simple to decide. When you affirm the resolution, it means that you give aid on a universal or blind level. You don't consider the culture or politics of the region. What it means to negate the resolution is that you're still giving people humanitarian aid, you're still saving poor people throughout the world, but rather you're evaluating the culture and politics of the region to decide whether or not it would be responsible or logical to give aid in those situations. So in other words, we're still helping the poor, but rather we're picking and choosing our spots a little bit. So as long as I can articulate why there are certain spots or why there are certain instances where it would be incorrect or illogical to give humanitarian aid in those regions, that means that you negate the resolution on a linguistic level. So now you can look to the negative case. These two reasons are articulated throughout our case. The first argument talks about giving money to corrupt governments. Our opponent's only response is that we're not giving bombs, rather we're giving people food or medical supplies. First of all, there's no reason why a tyrannical government would want to let those food or medical supplies filter down to their own people. So it would be very wasteful to give humanitarian aid in that instance. Rather, we should restrict the aid on a political level and use it in a more effective way so we can actually help poor people throughout the world. They're going to get up here and tell you that this is a problem of implementation. We can go around the government, but first of all, that argument wasn't advocated in their last speech. Second of all, even if they want to go around the government, that's still a form of restricting the aid you give because necessarily you're going through a different avenue. The second argument comes out of the bottom of the case. They say that the argument is restricting a physical area and it's in no way tied to culture or politics. That's completely ignorant of the argument we're making. The argument is that in certain instances, poverty exists because the culture of the area has precluded economic development. Aid, therefore, prolongs reform and makes the problem worse. The only solution is to restrict aid in these cases and encourage free trade and economic development. So in other words, if you have a nomadic culture in an area or an agrarian culture, if we give them humanitarian aid, they're going to rely on that aid and there's no incentive to economically develop. The alternative is to restrict aid in those areas and rather beg and implore those countries to decrease their trade barriers and ultimately include economic development. So now you can look to the affirmative case. They really only extend two arguments throughout their whole case. The first one is that restrictions are ephemeral. First of all, they don't necessarily explain what that means. But second of all, I would argue that that's not what the negative is advocating. We're not presenting a cultural political agenda, but rather we're saying the culture or politics of a region are not conducive to humanitarian aid. The only other argument they're extending is that people need the bare minimum of money before you can have economic development. That comes out of the bottom of the affirmative case. First of all, in their last speech, they didn't extend why that was true. They didn't say why you need a bare minimum of money in order to incite economic development, so you can't buy the argument. It should bounce right off your ballot when they give their next speech. So the only real arguments they have are coming out of the affirmative case, which I just rebutted, and the argument about implementation. However, I clearly extended the arguments out of the negative case. I said that they're not implementation problems, but rather on a holistic political and cultural level, there are certain areas that aren't conducive to aid. Thank you.
Thank you. Third affirmative rebuttalist, Daniel Rauch.
Okay. I'm a bit of a novice at Lincoln Douglas debate. However, in my brief time here, what I've found is that Lincoln Douglas debate, unlike other forms of debate, doesn't focus on the empirics, as our opponents would have you believe, but rather it focuses on larger values and principles. As such, if we can prove that our values and principles supersede theirs, then even if we are losing the empirics debate, we could still come out on top. That said, let's move to their case and specifically to their attack on the concept of rights. They tell you that when we choose to give government money directly to people, we do not choose this as this is a government-based restriction. However, as was articulated by Jeff himself in cross-examination, there are times when rights can be delivered by different means and still have equal value. And what we are proposing is that should we give money directly to the people instead of, say, corrupt governments, we are not infringing or changing anyone's rights. Indeed, even Robert Mugabe himself, the head of the corrupt government in Zimbabwe, would have the same equal rights to access of aid. The only question would be how it would be delivered. Now let's look to their values. They tell you that their value is institutional legitimacy, to which I say if an institution condones great human harms and human sufferings and the inequality of man, then it cannot be legitimate, and that clearly we must take a view of a broader picture, a view that emphasizes the value and worth of each individual human. Indeed, this is a view which I'm sure our opponents would acquiesce to. The restrictions they give you in order to achieve this place where everyone meets these basic rights, is a place where agrarian or nomadic groups do not receive aid because it will foster dependency. However, being agrarian has nothing to do with a culture or politics. You don't vote to become an agrarian. You live in an agrarian area. This is a logistical event. And despite what they might have told you, this is untrue. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, they give you no mechanism in which these restrictions would be implied. This was glossed over again and again and again. They consistently told you that, based on empirical evidence, local standards will be implied. What this basically means is whoever's giving out the money can give it out or restrict it however they want. As Greg clearly stated in the 1AR, many governments do not give it out objectively or even with the best of values. For example, the United States, a place which prides itself on values, has decided to restrict aid to people who don't use condoms. This isn't a universal value. It's not even practiced by anyone in my high school. And as a result, we can clearly see that the United States is applying based on an ephemeral belief. Unfortunately, this is not a minor side issue, as they've mentioned, but in fact, this is the crux of the case. Can we accurately and justly apply restrictions? And if it can be proved that nobody, no matter how well-minded or well-intentioned they are, can justly apply these restrictions, then we will prove their value to be unjustified. Unfortunately, all human institutions are imperfect, and we will inherently fail. But to say that these imperfect institutions can deprive people of the fundamental right to life, the right to medicine, food, or shelter, is to say that these imperfect conditions have perfect predictive powers, that they will use empirical evidence to solve local problems. And because these are truly imperfect institutions, clearly you have no choice but to issue a resounding negative ballot.
Time. And that concludes this debate. Audience, how about a show of appreciation? Bill Barthelmy collects the judges' sheets and the points are tallied, let's take a field trip to Millburn and to Randolph.
Welcome to Millburn High School, home to 1,200 students, 26 varsity sports, and 75 other clubs and organizations. Here at Millburn, students have the opportunity to study a wide variety of academic disciplines. The course catalog lists 225 options from which students may choose, and 50% of the student body elects to study at the AP level. Also strong in the arts, today Millburn plays host to the Region 1 Orchestra Festival. Its own bands, choruses, orchestras, and specialty vocal and instrumental ensembles boast membership of 400. Finally, the forensics team is the cornerstone of Millburn's extracurricular repertoire. Under head coach Brian Raymond, its debate squad captured the 2006 New Jersey State Championship in addition to placing 7th in the nation.
Welcome to Randolph High School, home to nearly 1,700 students, 24 varsity sports, and over 25 extracurricular and co-curricular organizations. Over 95% of our graduates pursue higher education. One of Randolph's most successful teams is forensics. In the last several years, the team has grown from being a small group of competitors to one of Randolph High School's largest organizations with nearly 90 members. Team accomplishments include qualifying for a National Forensic League tournament and the Lincoln Douglas Tournament of Champions, and now once again here in New Jersey as finalists in the JPMorgan Chase Lincoln Douglas debates. In its 18 years, the Randolph Forensics team has been fertile ground for both a healthy competitive spirit and many long-lasting friendships.
Here with me is Christine Flora, Vice President, JPMorgan Chase, and our inexperienced tier teams, their coaches and their alternates. Robert Pasternak from Westfield High School with alternate Satya Tagat, and Coach Michael Freiser with alternate Irene Claudius from Bayonne High School. Christine, please tell us which team will take home the trophy.
On a 3-2 decision, Bayonne High School.
Our top debaters each receive a check for $500, a debates jacket, and of course, ownership of the trophy for the year. Finalist debaters take home $250 each, a jacket, and a finalist plaque. Our experienced teams are with us now with their alternate and coaches, Brian Raymond from Milburn and Coach Eileen Waite from Randolph, along with alternate Aaron Rubenstein. Christine, let's end the suspense. Which team is this year's winner for the JPMorgan Chase Lincoln Douglas debates?
In a 3-2 decision, Randolph.
Congratulations to all our teams, and especially to the winners for presenting their sides so successfully. We also want to thank the New Jersey Department of Education, Rutgers University, and the New Jersey Forensic League for supporting this program, which recognizes the mental athletes in New Jersey's high schools. Thanks also to JPMorgan Chase Vice Presidents Bill Zook and Christine Flora for organizing the entire debate program. Without you and your dedicated staff, this event could not take place. And so this concludes this year's debates for JPMorgan Chase and New Jersey Network. I'm Desiree Taylor. Thanks for being with us.